Welcome to South Point Church Online, wherever you might be watching from today. And if you're new, thanks so much for joining us. My name's Matt, and I'm part of the team here at South Point. Hey, I want to jump right in today and tell you why sticking around might matter, regardless of where you're at in faith, whether you have no faith, or maybe you grew up with different faith, or maybe you've been a follower of Jesus since you were a little kid. Here's something that I know about everyone who is watching right now, is that you do not want to be the villain of your own story, and you definitely don't want to be the villain in someone else's story. You see, there's a reason why I think so many of us love movies and stories and books and plays. It's because they remind us of the heroes that we want to be in real life. Matter of fact, if you've watched a movie or a TV show in the last week, why don't you just type in movie or show in the chat? And here's something that I discovered to be true about almost every story, every play, every book, and it's this, is that anyone that continues to tell a lie that keeps people in pain, they are never the heroes. That's right, they are always the villain. The good guys aren't the ones who tell lies that keep people in pain. The only ones, even if they don't realize it, that continue a lie that hurts people are the bad guys. And here's what I know about you if you're watching this, is you don't want to be the bad guy. You don't want to be the villain in your story. And you know what? I've discovered firsthand the destructive power that a lie has in someone's life. This is a true story I want to share from you. It happened about a year and a half ago. It was a couple days before Thanksgiving. I had been called to the hospital to see my grandmother. Hospice had been called in. And so I was there the night before she kind of passed away. And it was evening, and I was kind of holding her hand. And I was sitting there with her, just comforting her. And she was kind of resting and was somewhat at peace between the medication. And all of a sudden, I was jolted. My grandmother woke up, and she kind of looked around, and she started crying, and she says, "I can't breathe. I can't breathe." And so I immediately stood up, and I looked at my grandma. I said, "Grandma, it's okay." And I made sure her oxygen was in and let her know she was okay. And she began to settle down, and she was breathing in the oxygen. You see, my grandmother had terminal COPD, which is a chronic lung infection that she can no longer take oxygen in. This is how my grandmother's life ended. But it all ended because she believed a lie when she was a young kid. You see, my grandmother believed that smoking was cool and sophisticated, and it wouldn't harm her. So at a very young age, my grandmother started smoking, and my grandmother smoked for 60 years. And I bet the day that my grandmother started smoking and she believed that lie about cigarettes, that she never imagined how damaging and devastating the consequences of believing that lie would be in her life. And you might be asking, "Matt, why are you even starting and telling us that story?" Well, here's why. What if when it comes to mental health, that you, that me, that we believe a lie that's just as deadly and devastating as the lie my grandmother believed about cigarettes? That's why here at South Point, we are so passionate about starting this brand new series. And here's the name of the series. It's okay. It really is okay to need Jesus and a therapist. Because somehow, even in churches, but definitely in culture, right, the normal response to mental illness or mental health or behavioral health is stigma, is silence, and shame. Where did that come from? Because I know this to be true. Stigma and shame are tools that Jesus never, ever used. Why would the church use them? And why does culture lift up silence and shame and stigma when it comes to mental and behavioral health? Where does that come from? Well, it comes from a lie that most of us will believe, and unfortunately, that most of us, even in the church, will continue to pass on. And you might be asking, what is this deadly lie that leads to destruction that we need to kind of uncover? Well, there's lots of lies, unfortunately, about mental health. But there are two devastating lies that are the core of the stigma and the shame and the silence that both the culture and the church has believed and passed on when it comes to mental health. And so we just want to uncover the very first lie. And we're going to put it up on the screen. It's this. Here's the lie. The damage and imperfections inflicted on us by a broken world are wrong, unacceptable, and even worse, it's our fault. For some reason, in our culture and even in churches, we believe somehow that we should go through life and never receive damage and that we should be perfect and never have any imperfections. But you know this and I know this. That's impossible, right? We live in a broken and busted world with flawed people. Getting damaged and having imperfections is going to happen in a broken world with flawed people. This lie means that you and I should try to do something that's impossible, which is be invincible. And you know what this does? When we get damaged, when we have our imperfections revealed, do you know what happens? We get stuck in a shame loop because someone lied to us and said, it's your fault. And so if you're here today and you've experienced trauma, if you have some imperfections when it comes to mental and behavioral health, it is not always your fault. Sometimes life damages us. Sometimes in life, there are imperfections in our life and in our body that cause us not to work. And for us to aim at an impossible goal, to never experience damage or trauma or imperfections, only sets you and I up to stay stuck in a shame loop. Now, there's a second lie that is absolutely just as deadly as this lie. Because if you believe this lie, that it's your fault and it's unacceptable to have imperfections and to receive damage, you will believe it's your fault. But there's another lie just as deadly. We're going to put up on the screen. It's this. Just ignore stuff and pretend that my pain or your pain or our pain and sadness and hurt doesn't matter and they will magically go away. I don't know about you, but there's something about our Western culture, both in church and in society, that says that when you have bad feelings or sad feelings or painful feelings, we're not going to talk about them. We're not going to write about them. We're not going to share about them. We're just going to stuff. We're just going to ignore. We're going to pretend that they're not there. Because if we do that, somehow they'll magically go away. And you know this, and I know this. Listen, doing nothing solves nothing. Why in the world would the church, why in the world would the culture tell us and set us up for the impossible, that we'll never be imperfect or never receive damage in a busted and broken world with flawed people? And why would it tell us this lie that if we ignore and stuff and pretend, that it'll magically go away? Because you know this and I know this. When we stuff and ignore, all we do is take something and stuff it, and it always comes out. And when it does, it is usually dysfunctional. And it leads us to a problem when it comes to mental health. Believing a lie that harms ourselves and others isn't only unwise, it's self-destructive. And that's something that none of us want. And it got me to asking this question: why in the world would culture and why in the world would the church, one, believe these lies, and two, pass these lies on? Well, I have a guess about culture, and I have a pretty good idea because I've lived in the church world for a pretty long time. Now, when it comes to culture, I believe the reason that we continue to pass these two lies on are really simple. You know what our culture values? Our culture values two things. We want people to produce and we want people to buy. That is kind of what Western culture is all about. That's what we value. Can you produce and can you buy stuff? And basically, if anyone has health issues or behavioral issues or mental health issues, that is an interruption and an inconvenience to what we can get from you and what you can give me. And so we want to hide that. In some sense, we want to ignore the reality of our busted and broken world. Now, when it comes to why would church believe this lie? Why would church continue to pass this lie on even though it's unwise and self-destructive? Well, it's for a truth, and this is one of those buckle up moments. And maybe you grew up in a church like this, and I don't mean to be mean, but we just need to be honest so that stigma and shame and silence are no longer the tools that we respond to mental and behavioral health. And so I'm going to put it up on the screen, and it's this. Religiosity has the habit of weaponizing. So religious folk will weaponize spirituality to dismiss the holistic way that God created all of us. There's something about religiosity that says, let's focus on spirituality at the cost of the other ways that we're made. Let's ignore that God made us multifaceted. He gave us different components to what it means to be a human being. And so what religiosity does is it weaponizes spirituality and says, listen, we're just going to focus on that and the rest doesn't matter. And it dismisses and it ignores the holistic way that God created us. Matter of fact, Jesus tells us that God created us multifaceted and holistically. We see this in the eyewitness account of the Gospel of Mark, Mark 12:20. And I'm going to put up on the screen, here's the words of Jesus. And he says, you must love the Lord your God with all your heart. See that we're emotional beings. We're emotional beings. God made us to have feelings, that we would have joy, that we would be able to have sadness, that we'd be able to have compassion. God says, love him with all your heart. We have emotions. He said, love him with all your soul. We're spiritual beings that will never, ever die. We will live in eternity. And he says, love him with all your mind. There's a mental and intellectual side to every human being. That's where free will and the ability to choose and make decisions. We are not robots. The ability to actually truly love comes from the ability to make a decision. We need to have a mental capacity and all of your strength. We are physical beings. And here's what religiosity does. Religiosity will take the spiritual component and it'll tell you, oh, you should move that in the middle. And if you kind of use spirituality in the middle of that, it'll make sure that all these others go right. And you know what I've discovered about church folk and people that believe and buy into that? They buy into it. Here's why. Because they promise something that isn't true and you will actually never experience. And instead, if you put spirituality in the center, that you will get a pass from pain, you'll get a pass from problems, and you'll get a pass from trauma. And that just isn't true. Matter of fact, Jesus himself said, in this world, you will have trouble. Now, if you look at this, you go, well, something should be in the middle, and shouldn't that something be God? And the answer is yes, but it shouldn't be religiosity. In the middle of that should be a relationship with Jesus. That's why Jesus says, come to me. And see, when we put Jesus in the center, a relationship, not religiosity, that relationship with Jesus determines how we relate physically, how we relate mentally, how we relate spiritually, and how we relate emotionally. And what Jesus lets us know is we can relate rightly to God, ourselves, and other in all those areas in a way that honors him and honors who we are, but it doesn't give us a pass. And I'm telling you, there are reasons why churches will do that is because people give to it and they will show up if they believe they can get a pass from pain, problems, and trauma, but it's just not true and it's not biblical. And it leaves all of us, again, regardless of whether you showed up and you're just curious about this whole God thing. Or maybe you grew up in a whole different faith background where you didn't even really talk about God and Jesus in the Bible. Or maybe you've been a follower of Jesus since you were a little kid. It leaves all of us asking this really important question. It's this right here we're going to put up. How do we not believe and pass on the destructive lies about mental and behavioral health? How do we get rid of the stigma? How do we get rid of the silence? How do we get rid of the shame? How do we uncover those lies? Well, that is the whole goal of this series. Now, this series is going to run for another 4 or 5 weeks, right? So I can't cover everything in one day. So if you go, hey, you didn't cover this thing I was hoping you were going to cover, it's okay. We have several more weeks, but I need to debunk 4 myths that keep shame, silence, and stigma being normalized when it comes to mental and behavioral health. So we need to uncover those. But before we do, I want to stop for a second and I want to speak to everyone watching. I understand that there are all kinds of people from all kinds of walks and all kinds of situations watching today. And so I'm going to put this up on the screen and I'm going to say, if you're here today and what I'm talking about has brought up feelings and you are just overwhelmed in this moment, we want to say we are for you. And unfortunately, on South Point staff, there are no professional or licensed counselors. And if you feel overwhelmed as you're watching this and you need a professional licensed counselor, we want to provide you the crisis hotline and a number to text so that you can get immediate help. Now, South Point, we want to be for you. If you watch this video or if you realize, listen, I realize that I have some feelings. I realize that I have some pain and some hurt that I shouldn't stuff, ignore, and pretend isn't there. Well, we have this resource. You can go to www.southpointforyou.com/time to talk. And you can have a time to connect with a pastoral staff person who will do a one-time kind of like connection thing and try to connect you to resources. South Point will pay for several counseling sessions if that's something that you need to help you. We also have something called Stephen's Ministry, which are not a professional counselors, but walk alongside people in difficult seasons. We also have something called Celebrate Recovery that is a recovery group. We also have small groups. And so what we want to do is provide an opportunity. If you go, hey, I'm hurting. Hey, I don't know what step to take, but I do want to take some step, that we'll have some resources. And later in the series, we're going to have an interactive time where some counselors are going to answer some questions live in this message of the questions that you ask. And so we'd like to start getting those questions in advance. And so if you have any questions in reference to mental or behavioral health, and you would like a professional and licensed counselor to answer that, please just go ahead and email that to church@southpointforyou.com. Because at South Point, we don't want something from you. We want something for you. Jesus died to set us free. He died to care for all of us. Jesus died for us physically. He died for us mentally. He died for us emotionally. And he died for us spiritually. It's funny. People will go, well, I don't believe really Jesus cares about our physical body because we're going to die and then go to heaven. Did you know that Jesus was resurrected physically? That we're not just spiritual beings, that we're physical beings that are going to live in physical bodies forever, and that we're going to continue to use our mind and we're going to continue to have emotions, that God created us as holistic beings. And so when we have to take a look at it, there are 4 myths that we need to debunk. There are these lies that we need to uncover so that we can rob stigma, silence, and shame of their power, so that we can bring this concept that mental and behavioral health are okay, and that the church can be one of the safest places in the world where people can turn to God and be supported and directed to resources that can actually help them get better and heal. So that's what I want to do, is briefly dive into these 4 myths. And again, this is going to be a series. So if I don't address something that you're interested in, I would encourage you to continue along with us as we go through the rest of the series. But here's the first myth that we have to debunk when it comes to mental health in the church. And we're going to put up here. Mental health myth number 1 is mental health is really a spiritual issue. Man, you will see and hear this all the time in church, right? Like someone will say, hey, I'm feeling sad. I'm feeling anxious. I'm feeling depressed. Maybe I have some post-traumatic syndrome, like there's something going on and I can't figure out what it is. And sometimes church people, meaning well, will say, well, you should just read your Bible more, or you should just pray more. And usually the church answer around mental or behavioral health is going, oh, you know what? That's really just a spiritual issue. You're not really kind of a mental being. You're really just a spiritual being. And so if you just take care of the spiritual thing, it'll fix that mental thing, which nothing could be further from the truth. And here's the reality. When we ignore one reality of who we are to favor another reality of who we are, that is not honoring, it is harmful. You see, when we deny the complexity of mental health, we dehumanize people made in the image of God. Can I say that one more time? When we deny the complexity of mental health, we dehumanize people that God loves and died for. Did you know there are multiple reasons that people can struggle with behavioral and mental issues or illnesses? I mean, did you know that mental illness, it can be genetically passed on? I know personally in my life that genetically in my family, there's a predisposition to mental illness that has been passed on from generation to generation. I've seen 4 generations of this in my family. Do you know that there's something that can happen in your brain physically that can cause mental or behavioral issues? So it's not a spiritual issue, it's actually a physical issue. Did you know that sometimes behavioral and mental health issues are driven by physiological issues? And what that means is sometimes there's a chemical imbalance, sometimes there's a hormonal imbalance, sometimes there's neurons, sometimes there's neuro things that are going in your brain that aren't working the way that they were intended to do. So there's a physiological problem that needs to be addressed. Also, did you know that sometimes trauma creates a response? Sometimes in life, when people experience trauma, it creates harm that needs healing. Just like if you fell and broke your arm, I wouldn't just pray for you and wouldn't tell you to read the Bible. I would get you up and take you to the ER. There are things that happen to us: loss, abuse, abandonment, There are environments that are harmful, that create trauma in our life, that don't go away just with prayer. They don't go away with just coming to church. They don't go away with just reading the Bible. Just like your arm needs to be set, there's something that needs to be reset. Did you know our environment plays into our mental health? Sometimes through no fault of our own, we can end up in an environment that impacts us in a way that impacts our behavioral and mental health. So there are so many complex things that go into, and sometimes it can be any number of those things. So when we ignore the one reality that we are mental beings to favor another reality that we are spiritual beings, isn't honoring our spirituality. It is harmful to our mental state. Now, I have a confession today, and it's something that you might not usually hear from a pastor. But here's the truth. Most of my life, I've had to struggle on and off in different seasons with something called mania and depression. It's been a genetical thing that was in my mom. It was in my grandmother. I have it in extended family members on both my mom and my dad's side. It's just something that I have to deal with. And when we say it's just a spiritual issue, we really rob people of their dignity, because I can tell you that some of my hardest seasons of struggling with both mania and depression were seasons where I would tell you that I was a spiritual 10. Now, some of the things I'm about to tell you may seem like I'm bragging, but I'm not. I'm just telling you that my spiritual life was healthy and whole. And what I mean by that is, in some of my deepest times where I was struggling either with mania or depression, I was fasting, I was praying, I was reading my Bible, I was taking a Sabbath, I was tithing, I honored purity. Like, I was doing all the spiritual things, and I felt close to God. But sometimes there's something broken in my mind and with trauma from the past that I need to continue to work on and get whole on. And when we believe the myth that a mental health issue is really a spiritual issue, what we just do is dehumanize people made in the image of God. And by the way, this is a biblical truth. You know, there are only two people in all of the Bible that we believe that God came from heaven and took them from earth to heaven without them dying. One of them is a guy named Elijah. Elijah was an Israelite. Elijah was a prophet. Matter of fact, Elijah was so connected to God, right, that when he prayed, it stopped raining for 3 years. And when he prayed it would rain, it rained. Elijah was so connected and so spiritually connected to God that he spoke to the waters and they parted. Did you know Elijah was so connected to God that when he called upon God for fire to fall from the sky, it fell? Elijah is one of the few people that are told that God literally shows up from heaven, gets in a chariot, and Elijah rides off to heaven and he avoids death. But there's this little section in the scripture that tells us Elijah struggled one time with depression so bad that he was suicidal. You see, Elijah was deeply and spiritually connected to God, yet he struggled with his mental health in a season. So let us not believe the myth that mental health is really a spiritual issue. Listen, the science tells us, is prayer good for us? Yes. But so is going on a walk. And so is seeing a therapist. And so is a good diet. And so is exercise. And so are a lot of things. Spirituality is absolutely a part of our health, but it is not the whole part. That sometimes there are things that happen in our brain and our bodies and around us in trauma that are outside the scope of our spiritual walk. Which leads us directly into myth number 2, which is this. Mental health myth number 2. Trauma and imperfections are a failure of faith. Man, I can't tell you the number of churches that will tell you if you just had more faith, you wouldn't be so anxious. If you just had more faith, you wouldn't be so depressed. If you just had more faith, this or that. And that is a lie. It is not biblical. And here's what I mean. That is a misunderstanding of what faith is. See, faith is never about our circumstances. Faith is always about our trust in the character of God. Let me say that one more time because this will preach. Faith isn't about our circumstances. Because I'm going to share in a few minutes about some biblical characters who didn't have good circumstances, but they had amazing faith. Because faith isn't about our circumstances, it's about our trust in the character of God, regardless of the circumstances around us. Did you know that King David, when he was an old man, his body failed him so bad that he couldn't stay warm? Did you know that Elisha, who was the prophet right after Elijah, who did twice as many miracles as Elijah, actually died of an illness? Did you know that Jesus was put on a cross unjustly and crucified? Did you know that Paul the apostle, who planted most of the first churches outside of Jerusalem and wrote a third of the New Testament, had a chronic illness? So if you're telling me that faith protects us from all the problems, from all the pain, and from all the trauma, if you just have enough faith, well then Jesus didn't qualify, Paul didn't qualify, King David didn't qualify, Elisha didn't qualify. It's just unbiblical and untrue to say if you have faith, you get a pass from pain, problems, and trauma. And I just want to say to anyone that went to a church that experienced abuse and abandonment and trauma and hurt, or maybe there's something physically or genetically broken, and someone lied to you and created shame in your heart by saying you just needed more faith. It is a myth. True story. I used to work for an organization called Young Life. Matter of fact, my wife and I left our family in Loudoun County to become missionaries here in St. Mary's to work with high school and middle school students. I left a really good job to make a little bit of money, and we left all of our family and friends. Matter of fact, this decision not only had financial implications, it had family implications. Our first child was born here. And I remember one time when I was on my way to go get some supplies, we were having some students over our house for a Bible study. So we're missionaries. We're not making good money. I was out in a hoopty van to buy some materials so that I could share Jesus with high school students and let them know that there was a God who's loved them. So I was on my way driving back, right? And it was daylight. I was following all the rules. I had my seatbelt on. I was almost late. I was doing everything I was supposed to do. Yet there was a driver who was speeding, who crossed a double line and hit me head on and created trauma and imperfection in my life. And I can promise you that didn't happen because I didn't have faith in God. It happened because we live in a busted and broken world with flawed people. If the expectation is that we will go through life without damage or imperfection, you will always deal with shame because that is not possible. So do not believe this myth that trauma and imperfections are a failure of faith. Matter of fact, some of the people that have the greatest faith are the people who've experienced the most trauma and have the most imperfections because they choose to trust in the character of God that someday He's going to come back and He's going to make it all right. Which directly leads me into myth number 3 that I want to share, and it's this: mental health myth. Feelings aren't important except the good ones, right? I mean, if we're really honest, in American and church culture, the feelings that we only ever talk about are the good ones. Matter of fact, most of the commercials are about having a good time. Most of our commercials are about, if you get this, you'll feel good. Because in our society and even in church, the only feelings that we think are really valuable are the ones that are good. And that's just not true. Sometimes when we have feelings of anger, of hurt, of sadness, of despair, of loneliness, those aren't inherently wrong or bad. They're just feelings. You know what I discovered? Feelings in themselves aren't bad. Ignoring them is absolutely wrong. I like what Lisa Turkhurst once wrote and said in a sermon. She said, feelings are indicators, not dictators. Did you know that most people believe that when you get leprosy, or if you got leprosy, that you would lose some of your limbs? And that's actually a myth. You see, leprosy is a disease that is a bacterial infection in your skin. And what really happens when you get leprosy is the bacteria attacks your nervous systems and you'll get what is called numbness. Your nerves will be dead. And why limbs fall off with people who have leprosy is not because of the leprosy, it's because their nerve endings are numb. They no longer get pain signals that something is wrong, so they don't know to fix it or address it, and so they further damage themselves until their body no longer works. And there's something about our church culture and American culture where we want to numb whatever pain we experience in life. And here's the reality. Pain is an indicator that if something is wrong, do not ignore it, fix it. Let me say that one more time. Pain isn't bad. Pain is actually good because it's an indicator that if something is wrong and that we need to fix it. Think about it. Have you ever gotten that annoying light and that sound when your gas light flashes and it goes ding, 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 or it flashes and it's annoying and it's painful and you hate it? But it does that to let you know so that you don't experience a deeper pain of being stuck on the side of the road without gas. Our feelings of sadness, of despair, of hurt and pain, they matter just as much as the good ones because they let us know that something is wrong, something is broken. Did you know that many of the Psalms are called lamentations, where people who passionately love God cried out in pain and in brokenness? Do you know the scriptures tell us that Jesus, when he showed up after Lazarus dies, it says he was upset and angry. He saw the sadness of the brokenness what of illness did to those around him. And it said he was angry, he was vexed. And then in the shortest verse in the whole Bible, it says Jesus wept. When Jesus went to the temple, he saw people who were struggling and who just wanted God to step into their lives and to be seen. And he saw the religious leaders exploit them for money, and it made him righteously angry. The night he was going to be betrayed, Jesus was so sorrowful, he said, I am sorrowful unto death. Even Jesus, the creator of the universe, had feelings that weren't good, but he admitted them and he talked about them. Because feelings that are hard or painful, they make us aware of something. They are indicators that there might be a problem that we should address. And if we're really honest, here in our Western culture in America, we are horrible at dealing with feelings we don't like. We're gonna medicate them with food and with alcohol and with porn or with entertainment. We don't know how to grieve. We just go back to working or filling our lives with things to numb. No wonder we numb our lives, and then when things break off, we go, well, what happened? It's because we bought into the myth that feelings aren't important, except the good ones. Which leads me into myth number 4 that we need to kind of uncover so that shame and stigma and silence aren't our response to mental health. And here's the last one. Needing help is weakness and laziness. I can't tell you the number of people that I've talked to who were devastated by churches and culture that when they finally got the courage to say, I need help, someone said, just pull yourself up, just stop it, just try harder, do all these other things. Listen, I want to tell you a truth, okay? Now, I want you to stop. I want you to lean in because you need to hear this. Listen, no one is invincible, right? Maybe you want to type that in the chat. No one is invincible. And if no one is invincible, then getting help is a health issue, not a character issue. Let me say that one more time. If no one is invincible, then getting help is a health issue, not a character issue. And so when we have behavioral or mental or things going on in our life that are beyond us because of trauma, because of imperfections, because of environment, because of our physiology, then we need to get help. And getting help isn't bad. Do you know what? Jesus wanted help. Jesus often asked the disciples to help him to do ministry. Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, said, I don't want to be alone. Would you help me? And he called Peter, James, and John and said, come be with me as I'm sorrowful. I need someone to keep company with me. Matter of fact, when trauma happened to Jesus and he was scourged and he was crucified, Jesus couldn't carry the cross. We don't think Jesus is weak. Someone had to help him and carry his cross for him. The scripture tells us that one of the ways that we love each other is to carry our burdens. Needing help isn't a character issue. It is a health issue. It's something that we should be okay with. It is not laziness or weakness to ask and to get help. I'll never forget when I was a young guy living with my adopted mom and dad. I had this old car, and this old car was leaking oil, and it was smoking. You drive it, and it would smoke from under the hood. It was a head gasket. And so I was on there, and I was trying to take off the head gasket, but I had to take the alternator. And the alternator, I don't know if it hadn't been replaced in a really long time. So I was on the hood of the car with this crowbar trying to get the alternator loose. And the crowbar slipped, and the crowbar came back, and I'm telling you, I hit myself right in the eye, right in the head. I hit myself so hard with that steel crowbar, I knocked myself off the hood of the car, onto the concrete driveway. I was seeing black and stars, and then when I kind of came to, I was like, what is this warm thing? And I put my hand on my eye. There was just blood dripping out. I was woozy. So I went to my neighbor, and I asked him to drive me to the ER. Now, that wasn't a sign of weakness. That was a sign of wisdom going, something's wrong. I should get help. That's not a character issue. That is a health issue. Do you see that those 4 myths, if we believe them and we don't uncover the lies, the church will continue to be a place that it should never be when it comes to mental and behavioral health. That by uncovering the lies of those 4 myths, we can get rid of the stigma and the silence and shame around mental and behavioral health. That mental and behavioral health isn't just a spiritual issue. That just because you have mental or behavioral issues doesn't mean that you have a failure of faith. That the only things that matter is, do you feel good? And that getting help is a sign of weakness or laziness. If I was going to sum up this message in one whole sentence, I would say it this way: it's okay to not be okay. Welcome to the human race. If you're not okay, that's great. That's why our message is, it's okay to need Jesus and a therapist, because we're all equal at the foot of the cross. It's okay to not be okay. You are not weak, and God is not mad, because he knows that in a broken world, it creates legitimate pain and damage. Listen, God is not mad when we suffer or when we're hurt. You are not weak when you suffer or you're hurt. God realizes that in a world that is broken and flawed with people that are busted, that real pain and real imperfections will happen. And if there was one thing I wanted everyone who ever watches this video from here into eternity to hear, this is what I would say. I would say it this way: God cares. He cares about all of you. He doesn't just care that you get to heaven someday. He cares about you physically. He cares about you spiritually. And he absolutely cares about you mentally and emotionally. God cares about all of who you are. And Jesus conquered hell and death so that all of us would find freedom in all of those areas, not just in one. Now, I want to close with a true but somewhat sad story. I went to a really good church when I was younger. Matter of fact, this church is where I found and said yes to Jesus. And this church had a lot of good things. One of the things that this church didn't do well was talk about mental health. Matter of fact, it fell on the side of favoring spirituality and really kind of ignoring the mental aspect. And I had a close family member who was amazing, just really loved Jesus and inspired me to want to be a better follower of Jesus. But this family member had some mental health and behavioral health issues. They struggled with bulimia. They self-harmed. They had some other issues going on. And because this church bought into the myth that it was just a spiritual issue, this person never got the mental health and the behavioral health help they needed. And it caused devastating destruction in their lives and the lives of our family. And it was heartbreaking. And at South Point, we don't want that for anyone. We want to be a safe place where we acknowledge that God made us physical beings and emotional beings and spiritual beings, but he also made us mental beings. And we don't want to deny the complexity of mental health, as we don't want to dehumanize anyone that Jesus died for. And so here is my challenge to anyone watching. I just have 2 challenges today. 1, please come back. And if you know anyone who needs to hear this message, please come back and show up next week as we continue the series. Second of all, I want to go back to that slide where we offered some resources. Hey, if you're watching this and you are just overwhelmed, again, there are no professional or licensed counselors on staff. I'm not one. I love Jesus, but I'm not a professional counselor. So we want to give you a hotline if that's what you need. If you have listened to this message and realized that you have some pain, you have some hurt, you have some things going on that you may need help for, please go to our website and sign up for a session where we can try to connect you to some resources where South Point wants to invest in you. And if you have any questions about mental health or behavioral health that you would like the counselors to answer, then please send those questions here. Because at the end of the day, you matter deeply to God. And Jesus died and conquered hell and death, and the tomb is empty for all of who you are, all of who I am, and all of who we are. Hey, let me pray. God, thank you. Thank you that you made us multifaceted beings where we have the ability to think and we have the ability to feel and we have physical bodies to enjoy bacon and chocolate. God, we thank you that you created us spiritual beings that live for eternity. God, help us to see that and see ourselves in this holistic manner. That God, that sometimes the answer is to get help in other areas, God, as we address that holistically, God. God, help us not to ignore one area that creates harm. God, help us to see each other holistically. God, I pray that anyone who is watching or listening that has believed the lies about mental health that create stigma, silence, and shame would hear a truth today that would set them free, because Jesus said, I've come to set people free, and whom the Son has set free is free indeed. This is our hope and our prayer in Jesus' name. And everyone who agreed said, Amen. Never forget, you matter deeply to God.